On July 1st, 1893, the President of the United States boarded a yacht in New York Harbor. He told the country he was going fishing. He was not going fishing. He was going to have a cancerous tumor cut out of the roof of his mouth on the open sea by 6 doctors in international waters, while America was collapsing into the worst financial panic of its century. The operation took 90 minutes. He returned to Washington 4 days later and gave a speech. His voice was barely changed. The country did not learn what had happened for 24 years. Grover Cleveland was the 24th President of the United States. He was also the first. Over the next century, the most photographed job in the world would hide its occupants in ways that began on that yacht and have not stopped to this day. A president would suffer a stroke that paralyzed half his body, and his wife would run the country for 17 months while the Senate visited the bedroom and was told he had a cold. A president would be diagnosed with terminal heart failure, and his physicians would let him run for a 4th term and travel to Yalta to negotiate the post-war world. A president would campaign on his vigor while his daily medications included amphetamines, painkillers, and steroids injected by a physician who would eventually lose his license. A president would forget the names of his own cabinet members, and his chief of staff would consider invoking the Constitution and decide, after a single dinner, not to. This is the story of the presidents of the United States. Not the story you were taught, the other one, the one that happened in the rooms the cameras were not allowed into. It is also the story of why, 59 years after the Constitution was amended to give the country a way to handle this, the country has never used it. Not for Wilson, not for Roosevelt, not for Kennedy, not for Reagan, not for any president in your own lifetime, including the one you are watching now. Most of what you are about to hear is in the official record. Some of it is in the medical files. Some of it is in the memoirs of the wives, the doctors, and the chiefs of staff who decided what the country was allowed to know. None of it is in your textbook. The 6 doctors who operated on Grover Cleveland were sworn to silence by the president himself. They kept the oath. One of them, William Williams Keene, broke it 24 years later in a magazine article after Cleveland was dead and the country he had governed had already forgotten the yacht. Keene wrote that the operation had been kept secret because the country could not have absorbed the truth. The economy was collapsing. The dollar was under attack. A president visibly dying of cancer, Keene believed, would have finished what the panic of 1893 had started. He may have been right. That is not the question this film asks. The question is what the country built on the foundation Cleveland laid. Because the men who came after him watched what he had done. The sea, the silence, the speech 4 days later in a voice barely changed. They understood something. The presidency could be hidden. The country could be managed. The instrument was the inner circle, the wife, the doctor, the chief of staff, the press secretary, the cabinet officer who knew and chose not to say. 26 years after the yacht, in the upstairs residence of the White House, on the morning of October 2nd, 1919, a woman would walk into a bathroom and find her husband on the floor. He was the President of the United States. He could not move the left side of his body. His doctor would arrive within the hour. Together, the two of them would make a decision about what the country was allowed to know. The decision would last 17 months. On the morning of October 2nd, 1919, Edith Bowling Wilson walked into a bathroom in the upstairs residence of the White House and found her husband on the tile floor. He was 62 years old. He was the 28th President of the United States. He could not move. The left side of his body had ceased to function. His left arm was limp. His left leg would not bear weight. His left eye, when she looked into it, did not track. His face on that side had collapsed into stillness. He was conscious. He could see her. He could not speak in sentences. He had spent the previous month on a train, traveling 15,000 miles across the country, giving 37 speeches in 22 days. He was fighting for the League of Nations. He had told his advisors that the Senate would not ratify the treaty unless the country demanded it of them. He had collapsed in Pueblo, Colorado on the 25th of September. The doctor on board, Carrie Grayson, had canceled the rest of the tour and brought him home. 8 days later, he was on the bathroom floor. Grayson arrived within the hour. He examined the president on the bedroom floor. The diagnosis was a massive stroke. The carotid artery on the right side of Wilson's brain had thrown a clot. The damage was permanent. There was no recovery in any meaningful sense available to medicine in 1919. The president would live. The president would not govern. Grayson and Edith made a decision together that morning. The country would not be told. The cabinet would not be told. The vice president would not be told. The Congress would not be told. The official story would be exhaustion and a digestive complaint. Edith would manage everything else. For the next 17 months, until the inauguration of Warren Harding on March 4th, 1921, Edith Bowling Wilson was the only person in the country who knew what was actually wrong with the President of the United States. She made the decisions about who saw him. She made the decisions about what papers reached his bedside. She made the decisions about what messages went out under his name. When documents required a signature, she sometimes guided his hand. When the hand would not cooperate, she signed for him. She would call this, in her 1939 memoir, her stewardship. It is the only word she used for it. She refused, until her death in 1961, to admit it had been anything else. The cabinet met without him. The Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, called the meetings together because no one else would. He did this for the better part of 6 months. In February 1920, Wilson found out. From his bed, through Edith, he fired Lansing for usurping the executive function. The president, who could not stand, had fired the Secretary of State for holding the country together in his absence. The cabinet learned of the firing by reading the newspaper. The Vice President of the United States, Thomas Marshall, was never officially briefed. He was kept away from the White House. Wilson had publicly called Marshall, before the stroke, a man of small caliber. Marshall knew his place. He told friends in private that he prayed every night for the president to recover or to die. He would not move on his own. Edith counted on this. The Vice President of the United States, by his own admission, refused to find out whether the President of the United States was alive enough to govern. Edith did not believe she was committing a crime. She believed she was protecting her husband from men who would finish him politically if they knew the truth. She believed she was protecting the League of Nations, which she had watched her husband nearly kill himself for. She believed there was no other arrangement available. The Constitution had no answer for a paralyzed president. The vice president was a coward. The cabinet was running on Lansing's nerve. She held it together. She would say until the end of her life that she had no choice. On April 14, 1920, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee sent 2 senators to the White House to verify that the president was capable of conducting foreign policy. The League of Nations vote was approaching. The country was tired of the silence. The Senate wanted to see. Senator Gilbert Hitchcock, a Democrat from Nebraska, was an ally of the president. Senator Albert Fall, a Republican from New Mexico, was an enemy. 3 years later, Fall would become Secretary of the Interior under Warren Harding. 2 years after that, he would become the first cabinet officer in American history to be sent to federal prison, convicted of taking bribes in the Teapot Dome scandal. He was not, by any standard of his career, a man committed to the truth. He was the man the Senate sent to see whether the President of the United States was still in command of himself. Edith prepared the room. She dressed Wilson in a sweater and a long jacket that hid his left arm. She propped him in bed on pillows that hid the slumped left shoulder. She arranged blankets over his legs to hide the paralyzed left side completely. The bedroom lights were dimmed. The senators were brought in. Wilson spoke. He made small talk. He referenced a Senate bill currently in committee. He made a joke about Fall's home state of New Mexico. Fall walked out and told the waiting press that the president seemed all right to him. He was not all right. He had not been all right for 6 months. The Senate accepted Fall's verdict. The Senate accepted itself for accepting it. The country accepted the Senate. 5 months after the staged bedroom visit, the Senate took its final vote on the League of Nations. The compromise version contained reservations that Wilson had refused to accept. The reservations were not, in the judgment of most of the historians who have studied them, fatal to the League. Wilson, paralyzed, sent word through Edith that Democratic senators should vote against the compromised version. They obeyed. The League of Nations died on that vote. The world spent the next 20 years without the institution Wilson had nearly killed himself to create. The institution he had spent his career building was killed by the woman who was keeping him alive. Wilson lived until February 1924. He never recovered the use of his left side. He never gave another major speech. He died 3 years after leaving office in the townhouse on S Street with Edith at his bedside. Edith Bowling Wilson lived until December 28, 1961. She attended John F. Kennedy's inauguration earlier that same year in the front row as the surviving First Lady of a presidency 4 decades gone. She published her memoir in 1939. In its 386 pages, she used the word stewardship 4 times. She used the word deception 0 times. The country never found out the full extent of what had happened in the upstairs residence until decades after both Wilsons were dead. The newspapers did not investigate. The cabinet did not testify. The Constitution had no provision for what had occurred. The men who came after Wilson in the White House looked at the 17 months Edith had managed and learned what was possible. Their own physicians, their own wives, their own chiefs of staff would soon face their own versions of the bathroom floor. The instrument had been proven. The country could be managed. The lesson would not be lost. 25 years later, a Navy doctor named Howard Bruin would walk into Bethesda Naval Hospital to examine a president of the United States whose blood pressure was 186/108. He would write down what he found. He would be told to tell no one. He would obey. In the early months of 1944, the President of the United States was visibly dying, and almost no one in the country had been told. Reporters who had covered Franklin Roosevelt for a decade were writing privately to their editors that they thought he had months to live. The photographs from the White House had stopped showing him from certain angles. His weight had dropped. His face had hollowed. His hands had begun to tremble in ways that could no longer be entirely hidden from the newsreel cameras. He was 62 years old. He had been president for 11. His personal physician, Ross McIntyre, was an ear, nose, and throat specialist. He had no formal training in cardiology. He had been the president's doctor for the entire decade Roosevelt had been in office. He had been telling the press for the entire decade that the president's health was excellent for his age. By March of 1944, he could no longer continue to say it without something a cardiologist would have to confirm. So, he sent for one. On the morning of March 28, 1944, a 38-year-old Navy lieutenant commander named Howard Bruin walked into the cardiology consultation room at Bethesda Naval Hospital and examined the President of the United States for the first time. Bruin was a young man and a careful one. He had trained at Johns Hopkins. He was the senior cardiology resident at Bethesda. His notes from that morning still exist. The first line records the blood pressure, 186/108. The second line records the pulse, rapid and irregular. The third line records the chest examination, rales in both lungs, an enlarged heart, the systolic murmur of left ventricular failure. His diagnosis, written in his own hand that day: hypertensive heart disease, hypertensive cardiovascular disease, cardiac failure of the left ventricular type, and acute bronchitis. In plain language, dangerously high blood pressure. A heart enlarged from years of fighting it, lungs filling with fluid, an infection in the chest. In the medical idiom of 1944, what Bruin had written was that the patient was dying, not in years, in months. He told McIntyre what he had found. He waited for McIntyre's instructions. McIntyre told him to tell no one, not the president, not Eleanor Roosevelt, not Henry Wallace, who was still vice president at that moment. Not the cabinet, not the press. The country was, in 3 months, going to be asked whether it wanted to elect this man to a 4th term in the middle of a world war. The country was not going to be told what the country's senior cardiologist had just found. Bruin was a lieutenant commander, McIntyre was a vice admiral, and the Surgeon General of the United States Navy. The order was not a request. Bruin obeyed. He would obey for the next 14 months. He would, in fact, obey for the next 25 years. 4 months later, on July 20th, 1944, the Democratic Party meeting and convention in Chicago nominated Franklin Roosevelt for an unprecedented 4th term as President of the United States. The nomination was made in his absence. He accepted it by radio from a rail car in San Diego, where he had been speaking to military personnel. The address lasted 20 minutes. Listeners would later remember thinking the voice sounded thin. The voice they were hearing was the voice of a man whose senior cardiologist had concluded 4 months earlier that he had less than a year to live. The 1944 campaign was managed with surgical care. Roosevelt traveled by train and by car. He spoke from open vehicles to crowds that were positioned at carefully chosen angles. He delivered one major speech in the rain in New York City on October 21st, riding 50 miles in an open Cadillac through a downpour, deliberately to refute the rumors that he was too sick to govern. He won that election. He won every state outside the deep Republican core. He won the popular vote by 3 million. He did all of this while dying. The voters did not know. His running mate did not know. His cabinet did not know. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did not know. Ross McIntyre stood at the podium during the campaign and told the press again that the president's health was excellent for his age. In February of 1945, the president traveled to Yalta. The journey took 14 days. He flew to Malta, sailed to Crimea, and was driven up a winding mountain road to a former imperial palace, where he met Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill across a round table to decide the shape of the post-war world. The photographs from Yalta are the photographs every American has seen, even if they cannot remember where they saw them. 3 men in dark coats. Roosevelt is the smallest. His face is hollow, his skin is gray, his eyes are sunken into the sockets. He holds a cigarette in a hand that does not look like the hand of a man who will be alive in a month. The other 2 men know. Churchill, in his memoirs, would write that he knew. Stalin, who said nothing, almost certainly knew. The men around the table had reason to know. They negotiated harder because they knew. The shape of post-war Europe, the position of the Polish border, the fate of Eastern Europe under Soviet occupation, these were settled in the days at Yalta by a dying man who would not see the spring. Stalin extracted what he could, because he understood that the man across from him would not be there to enforce what was promised. The cover-up that had protected Roosevelt politically had also placed a dying man at the most important diplomatic table of the 20th century, with 2 men across from him who could see what the American people could not. The defense of the cover-up has always been that the war was on. To change presidents in February of 1945 would have been an act of national risk no government could justify. Bruin would later say he believed this. McIntyre said it for the rest of his life. They may both have been correct. The war ended. The country won. The world entered the post-war order. The order it entered had been negotiated by a man whose senior cardiologist had given him less than a year to live, against 2 adversaries who knew this and bargained accordingly. The price of the cover-up is not in the medical record. It is on the map of Eastern Europe. On the 30th of March, 1945, Roosevelt traveled to his cottage at Warm Springs, Georgia, to rest. He had been there before. The polio he had contracted in 1921 had brought him to the warm waters of the local spring repeatedly over the years. He found it restorative. His doctors thought a few weeks there might steady him. On the morning of April 12th, he sat for a portrait. The painter was a woman named Elizabeth Shumatoff, who had been commissioned by an old friend of the president, Lucy Mercer Rutherford. Lucy had been Roosevelt's mistress in the 1910s. Eleanor had discovered the affair and demanded it end. It had officially ended. Lucy had returned to Roosevelt's life in his final months. Eleanor was not at Warm Springs that day. Lucy was. Roosevelt sat for the portrait at a table in the cottage. He was reading state papers as Shumatoff painted. At about 1 in the afternoon, he looked up and said, "I have a terrific headache." He slumped forward. He never regained consciousness. He died at 3:35 that afternoon, 82 days into his 4th term. The painting Shumatoff had begun that morning was never finished. It is held today at the Little Whitehouse historic site in Warm Springs. It shows the side of his face that was less hollowed than the other. It is gentler than the photographs. It was the last image of him. That evening, in the cabinet room of the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt told Vice President Harry Truman that her husband had died. Truman asked if there was anything he could do for her. She said, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." In the days that followed, Truman would discover what kind of trouble. He had been vice president for 82 days. He had met privately with Roosevelt twice in those 82 days. He had not been briefed on the war strategy. He had not been briefed on the diplomatic agreements at Yalta. He had not been briefed on the development of an atomic weapon that would, in less than 4 months, be dropped on Hiroshima. The Vice President of the United States learned that his country possessed a weapon capable of destroying a city after he had become the President of the United States. He learned it after Roosevelt's funeral. Howard Bruen went home from Bethesda after the funeral. He left the Navy. He returned to civilian medical practice in New York. He told no one what he had seen, what he had recorded, what he had been ordered to bury. He kept the notes. He kept the diagnosis. He kept the months of attending the dying President of the United States. In 1970, 25 years after Roosevelt's death, the medical community came for him. Historians had begun reconstructing the president's final year. Bruen was the only living man who had the medical record. He sat down and wrote a paper. He published it in the Annals of Internal Medicine in April of 1970, under the title Clinical Notes on the Illness and Death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The paper ran 22 pages. It reproduced his original 1944 examination notes verbatim. It made no defense of the silence McIntyre had imposed. It made no apology for having kept it. It put the record on the page 25 years late and let the medical community do what it would do with it. Ross McIntyre had died of a heart attack in 1959. He did not live to see Bruen's article. The funeral train carried Roosevelt's body from Warm Springs north to Washington, then west to Hyde Park, while a country that had elected him 4 times wept along the rails. The man who replaced him at the head of the country had been told, 82 days into his vice presidency, that the war was being run from a sickbed and the world had been redrawn by a dying hand. 8 years later, in January of 1953, a different kind of president would take the oath of office. A general, the most popular American alive, a war hero with a famous grin and a famously calm temperament. He would have a heart attack in his first term and a stroke in his second. The man who would manage the public story of his illnesses would not be his wife, or his doctor, or his chief of staff. The man would be his press secretary. And the press secretary would invent a method McIntyre could not have imagined. At 8 a.m. on the morning of September 25, 1955, James Haggerty walked into a hotel ballroom in Denver and changed the way the United States government would handle presidential illness for the next half-century. He was 46 years old. He had been the Whitehouse press secretary for 2.5 years. He had been a newspaper reporter for 16 years before that. He understood the press from inside it. The night before, the president had suffered a heart attack at his mother-in-law's home in Denver. The initial diagnosis had been indigestion. By dawn, Eisenhower was at Fitzsimons Army Hospital in an oxygen tent. He was 64 years old. He had been president for 2.5 years. Haggerty had a choice. He could do what every press secretary since Wilson had done. He could say the president was fatigued. He could say the president was resting comfortably. He could let the silence do its work. He chose differently. He announced on the public record that morning that the President of the United States had suffered a coronary thrombosis at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. The phrase meant a heart attack caused by a clot in one of the arteries feeding the heart muscle. He gave the location of the infarct, the section of muscle that had died from the lost blood supply. He named the attending physicians and gave their credentials. He committed to daily bulletins. He took questions. He answered them. It was the most detailed real-time disclosure of a presidential medical event in American history. It was also a piece of stagecraft so well executed that the country did not see it as stagecraft at all. What Haggerty had understood, faster than anyone before him, was that disclosure itself could be the cover. The country had been trained for half a century to expect silence on presidential health. A press secretary who gave it details, gave it numbers, gave it doctors with credentials, and a public schedule of bulletins was, in the country's mind, telling the truth. The truth he was telling was the truth he had chosen. He was telling it in the order he wanted. He was telling it inside the frame he had built. 6 weeks later, on the day the president was released from Fitzsimons, Haggerty had him photographed sitting up in bed in his pajamas. The pajamas had been embroidered in red thread on the breast pocket with 3 words: "Much better, thanks." The photograph ran on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The president had been told what to wear. The pajamas had been embroidered specifically for the photograph. The angle had been chosen by Haggerty himself. A man who had been near death 7 weeks earlier was, in the image the country saw, recovering with humor and lightness. The country relaxed. The country did not ask whether a man who had suffered a coronary thrombosis at 64 could finish out his term. The image had told the country he could. The image was the answer. 8 months later, the president underwent emergency surgery for ileitis, a severe inflammation of the small intestine at Walter Reed. Haggerty managed the disclosure exactly as he had managed Denver. The president was nominated for re-election 6 weeks later. He won in the largest electoral landslide to that point in American history. On the evening of November 25, 1957, Eisenhower suffered a small stroke at his desk in the Oval Office. He could not speak in full sentences. He could not remember the names of objects. Mamie Eisenhower called Haggerty. The President of the United States was unable to tell Haggerty what had happened because the words were not available to him. Haggerty disclosed the stroke within 24 hours. He framed it as a small cerebral occlusion, a blockage of a blood vessel in the brain. The word stroke was used in the official bulletins. The word minor was used more often. 6 days later, on the first day of December, the president drove himself to a Sunday morning service at the National Presbyterian Church to demonstrate that he had recovered. The cameras were waiting. The cameras had been told to wait. He sat through the sermon. He sang the hymns. He shook the Reverend Edward Elson's hand at the door of the church. He was, the photograph said, a man who could attend church. A man who could attend church could run the country. The country accepted the syllogism. What the country had not been told was that, in the months after Denver, Eisenhower and his vice president Richard Nixon had quietly drafted a private letter between them. The letter set out what was to happen if Eisenhower were ever to become incapacitated and unable to declare himself so, the vice president would assume the duties of the office. The agreement had no standing in the Constitution. It was an improvisation by a president and a vice president who had looked at the Wilson precedent and the Roosevelt precedent and concluded that the Constitution had no answer for what could come next. Eisenhower would later write that he believed the country needed a constitutional answer. He believed the Nixon letter had been the best they could do in its absence. He believed Congress would have to write the answer eventually. Congress would. It would take Kennedy's death to make them do it. In November of 1963, the President of the United States was murdered in Dallas. The country watched its vice president take the oath of office on an airplane on a runway in Texas. The line of succession was clear in the gross, but not in the detail. The country had spent 50 years generating presidential cover-ups for the cases when the president was alive but could not govern. The country had not built any procedure at all for the case when the president was simply gone. 3 weeks after Kennedy's funeral, on December 12, 1963, Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana introduced into the United States Senate a constitutional amendment. He had been working on it since the Eisenhower stroke. He had been thinking about it since the Wilson stroke. He had a draft. He thought the moment had come. He was right. 3 years and 2 months later, on February 10, 1967, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was ratified. It would never be used. On the afternoon of February 10, 1967, in the East Room of the White House, President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the 25th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. He was surrounded by congressmen, senators, and the constitutional lawyers who had spent the previous decade writing what they hoped would be the last word on a question the country had been asking for 100 years. What was to be done with a president who could not do the job? The amendment ran 4 sections. The first 2 clarified the line of succession and the procedure for filling a vice presidential vacancy. The second 2 were the substantive ones. Section 3 allowed a president to voluntarily transfer power to the vice president during temporary incapacity. The transfer would last as long as the president's written declaration left it in effect. The procedure was simple. The president writes a letter. The vice president takes the duties. The president writes another letter. The duties come back. Section 4 was the substantive one. Section 4 allowed the vice president and a majority of the cabinet acting together to declare in writing that the president was unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Upon such a declaration, the vice president immediately assumed the duties of the office. The mechanism was designed for one thing. It was designed for a president who could not act in his own defense, a president paralyzed in bed, a president in a coma, a president whose mind was no longer arriving at his mouth, a president of the kind the country had elected, watched in silence, and buried 4 times in the previous 50 years. The drafting committee had named the cases during the hearings. Wilson's stroke in 1919 had been the founding case. Roosevelt's heart failure had been the case where the country had not even been told. Eisenhower's 3 medical events had been the recent ones. Eisenhower himself had publicly endorsed the amendment in his memoirs. He had said the country needed it. There was a 4th case the committee did not name out loud because it was too recent and too painful. The young president who had been murdered in Dallas had been, by his own private medical record, the sickest man elected to the office in the modern era. The country had not known. The amendment was written in part for him. The amendment had arrived 4 years too late to have done him any good. The amendment was ratified by 38 states in 19 months. It was the fastest constitutional amendment to clear the states in the 20th century. The country wanted it. Section 3 has been used 6 times since 1967. Each use has been for a presidential surgery requiring anesthesia. The transfer has lasted hours. The president has resumed the duties of the office as soon as he came out of sedation. The mechanism has worked exactly as designed. Section 4 has never been used in 59 years, not once. In the years between Eisenhower's stroke and the ratification of the amendment, the country had been governed for 2 years and 10 months by the youngest elected president in American history. He had been 43 years old. He had been more photogenic than any man who had ever held the office. He had been, by any standard of public appearance, the picture of American vitality. He had also been, by his own private medical record, terminally ill before he was inaugurated. In the summer of 1960, a Time magazine investigation suggested that Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts, then competing for the Democratic Party nomination for president, had a serious medical condition called Addison's disease. The article was carefully worded. It did not assert the diagnosis outright. It said that Kennedy's appearance, his weight fluctuations, his unusually deep summer tan, and his hospitalizations in London and Boston in the late 1940s were consistent with the condition. The Kennedy campaign responded with a categorical denial. The statement was drafted by the candidate himself. It said that John F. Kennedy did not have and had never had Addison's disease. The statement was a lie. The candidate knew it was a lie when he wrote it. Kennedy had been diagnosed with Addison's disease in 1947. He had been 29 years old. He had been a first-term congressman from Massachusetts. He had collapsed at a public event in London during a trip he had taken in the company of his sister. The diagnosis had been made by a British physician named Sir Daniel Davis, in private consultation with a Kennedy family aide. Davis had told the aide that he gave the young congressman 1 year to live. Addison's disease, in 1947, was a death sentence. The adrenal glands produced the hormones the body needed to respond to stress, regulate blood pressure, and fight infection. Without those hormones, a patient who experienced a major physical stressor could go into adrenal crisis and die within hours. There was no cure. The newly developed corticosteroid replacement therapy was extending lives in the late 1940s, but the long-term consequences of taking corticosteroids daily for decades were not yet known. They would prove, in Kennedy's case, to be catastrophic. He received last rites 4 times between 1947 and his inauguration in January of 1961. The first was in 1947, after the London diagnosis. The second was in 1951, after a hospital admission. The third was in 1954, before a major back surgery from which he was not expected to recover. The fourth was in 1955, during a hospital readmission. A Catholic president of the United States was inaugurated in 1961, having been 4 times anointed for death. In 1960, when Time raised the diagnosis, the Kennedy campaign needed the denial to hold. The candidates sat down and drafted it. He defined Addison's narrowly as a condition caused by tuberculosis of the adrenal glands. He said he did not have that condition. He did not say what condition he did have. The autoimmune destruction of his adrenals, which is what he actually had, produced exactly the same clinical effects as the tuberculosis form. It was, in every way that mattered, Addison's disease. He had it. He wrote that he did not. The press accepted the denial. The country accepted the press. He was nominated. He was elected. The voters cast their ballots without knowing what they were electing. By the time Kennedy was inaugurated, his medical regimen had grown to a daily cocktail of medications managed by his official physicians and supplemented, after the first months of 1961, by weekly injections from an unaffiliated doctor in New York. His daily medications, reconstructed by the historian Robert Dallek from records released by the Kennedy family in 2002, included corticosteroids for the Addisons, painkillers for the back, antispasmodics for ulcerative colitis, sleeping pills, antibiotics for chronic urinary tract infections, synthetic stimulants, anti-anxiety medications, topical anesthetics, and hormone replacements. The cocktail required careful daily timing and constant adjustment. The official White House physicians, Janet Travel and George Berkeley, managed the bulk of it from the basement of the residence. The back, by the time of the presidency, was its own crisis. Decades of corticosteroid use had thinned his vertebrae into a kind of structural insufficiency. He could not bend down to put on his own socks. He could not pick up his own children. He wore a corset-like brace under his clothes that held him upright. The brace was tight enough that he could not slouch. Some Kennedy historians have argued that the brace held him so rigidly upright in the back of the limousine in Dallas that he could not duck. In May of 1961, in the weeks before his summit with Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna, Kennedy began seeing a New York physician named Max Jacobson. Jacobson was a refugee from Nazi Germany who ran a clinic on East 72nd Street in Manhattan. His patients included Truman Capote, Eddie Fisher, Tennessee Williams, Marilyn Monroe, and Mark Rothko. His patients called him Dr. Feelgood. His injections were a mixture of amphetamines, steroids, animal placenta extract, vitamins, calcium, and substances he refused to disclose. The exact composition varied. He kept no records. He never named his ingredients. In 1975, the New York State Board of Regents revoked his medical license, citing 48 separate counts of unprofessional conduct. By then, he had ceased to matter. Between 1961 and 1963, while he held that license, he had injected the President of the United States at least 34 times by his own records in the visitor logs of the White House and the Kennedy residences. He was on Air Force One during the trip to Vienna. He was at Hyannis Port. He was at the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The summit with Khrushchev took place in Vienna on June 3rd and 4th of 1961. Kennedy had thrown his back out at a tree planting ceremony in Ottawa 2 weeks before. He arrived in Vienna in significant pain. Jacobson traveled with him and injected him before each session. Khrushchev came away from Vienna convinced that the young American president was weak. The Soviet General Secretary would later tell his son that he had treated Kennedy like a small boy. Within 2 months, the East German government would begin construction of the Berlin Wall. Within 16 months, the Soviet Union would attempt to deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. What happened across the table in Vienna was the work of 2 men. One of them was the most experienced Cold Warrior alive. The other was a 44-year-old American on amphetamines, painkillers, and steroids whose back hurt enough that he could barely sit upright in a hardback chair. In October of 1962, the country and the world came within hours of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. American military planners had developed full-scale invasion plans for Cuba. American B-52 bombers were airborne, armed, on continuous rotation. Soviet submarines in the Caribbean carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes. American naval vessels dropped depth charges to force the submarines to surface, not knowing what they carried. Through all 13 days, the President of the United States was on his daily corticosteroid cocktail, painkillers for the back, antibiotics for a flaring urinary tract infection, antispasmodics for the colitis, and additional injections from Jacobson, who had been brought to the White House at the request of the President himself. By Dalek's reconstruction, no President of the United States, before or since, has held office on more daily medications than John Kennedy in October of 1962. He held the world together. He did not start the war. He negotiated the standoff to a resolution. The historians who have studied his decision-making during those 13 days are largely in agreement that he handled it with judgment, restraint, and skill. They have arrived at this conclusion knowing what the country did not know at the time. They have arrived at it knowing the pharmacological state the man was in. The defense of the Kennedy cover-up has always been that the man performed. The defense is correct. The man performed. The country, voting in 1960, had no way to know whether he would. Kennedy was murdered in Dallas on November 22, 1963. He had been president for 2 years and 10 months. He was 46 years old. His medical records were sealed by the Kennedy family for the next 4 decades. In 2002, his last surviving siblings authorized the release of 3 boxes of his personal medical records to the historian Robert Dallek for the purposes of historical research. Dallek's reconstruction was published in 2003. It was the first time the country had been given a complete picture of what it had elected, watched, mourned, and never been able to look at directly. By the time Dallek published, the amendment that had been written, in part, for John Kennedy had been in place for 36 years. The amendment had never been used. The next president for whom it would seriously be considered was a man who had spoken at Kennedy's funeral, a man who had outlived Kennedy by 25 years, a man whose chief of staff would, in February of 1987, walk into the White House holding a memo about the president's mind. That chief of staff was Howard Baker. The memo was written by his deputy, James Cannon. The president was Ronald Reagan. On February 27, 1987, Howard Baker walked into the West Wing of the White House to begin his tenure as the new chief of staff. He was a former United States Senator from Tennessee. He had been Senate Majority Leader. He had been the Republican Vice Chairman of the Senate Watergate Committee. He had asked, on national television in 1973, the question that defined the inquiry into Richard Nixon: what did the president know and when did he know it? He had taken the chief of staff position because the Reagan presidency was, in February of 1987, in catastrophic trouble. 3 months earlier, the country had learned that the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran in violation of an arms embargo and diverted the proceeds to fund anti-government rebels in Nicaragua in violation of a congressional prohibition. The scandal had a name: Iran-Contra. The president's approval rating had collapsed from 67% to 40% in 8 weeks. His previous chief of staff, Donald Reagan, had been fired by Mrs. Reagan over the telephone. The White House was paralyzed. On Baker's first weekend at the White House, his deputy, James Cannon, conducted what amounted to a private inquiry. Cannon was a veteran of the Ford administration. He was a careful man. He spent his first 2 days walking the halls of the West Wing, sitting with the secretaries, the schedulers, the policy aides. He asked the same questions of each of them. How is the president doing? What does he know? What does he not know? The answers were not what Cannon had expected to hear. He was told the president was inattentive. He was told the president spent long stretches disengaged from the briefing material. He was told the president had become reliant on talking points to a degree that worried the staff. He was told the president sometimes confused the names of cabinet officers. He was told the staff had developed informal workarounds for keeping the president on schedule and on subject. Cannon wrote it down. He drafted a memorandum to Howard Baker recommending that the new chief of staff consider whether the situation merited invoking Section 4 of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The amendment had been ratified 20 years earlier. The mechanism had been written for exactly this scenario. The vice president and a majority of the cabinet could, together, declare the president unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The vice president would then become acting president. The procedure was in writing. The trigger was clear. James Cannon was the first senior American official in 20 years to write down the recommendation that the trigger be pulled. He was not the only witness. In late 1986, the CBS News correspondent Leslie Stahl had been granted a White House meeting with the president. She had covered him since the beginning of his presidency. She knew his rhythms. She knew his face. Stahl wrote about the meeting in her 1999 memoir, Reporting Live. When she walked into the Oval Office, the president was, in her word, gaga. He was staring into the distance. He did not respond to her greeting. He did not appear to recognize her. Then, she wrote, something engaged him. The Reagan she knew arrived. He smiled, told stories, ran out the clock with practiced charm. The meeting ended. Stahl walked out of the West Wing into the press parking lot and stood there in the cold for several minutes. She would later write that she was, in that moment, frightened. She did not file the story. She had no diagnosis. She had no doctor on the record. She published the impression 12 years later when Reagan was already in the public stages of his Alzheimer's. The president's son, Ron Reagan, published his own memoir in 2011, called My Father at 100. In it, he wrote that he believed he could see early indicators of his father's dementia during the second term. He did not make a diagnostic claim. He wrote what he saw. What Howard Baker did with the Cannon memo has been told and retold by every person in the room. The accounts are consistent. Baker read the memo. He took it seriously. He decided that he would not act on the recommendation until he had seen the president for himself. That weekend, Baker had dinner with Ronald Reagan. At the dinner, the president was sharp. He was engaged. He told stories. He made decisions. He asked questions about Baker's family, about the Senate, about the days ahead. He gave every appearance of a man fully in command of himself. Baker left the dinner and told Cannon the next morning that the memo was wrong. He would not take the matter further. He tabled the memo. The amendment was not invoked. Ronald Reagan completed his second term as President of the United States. He left office on January 20th, 1989, 2 weeks before his 78th birthday. In November of 1994, 5 years and 10 months after leaving the White House, Ronald Reagan wrote an open letter to the American people. The letter, in his own hand, informed the country that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He thanked the country for the privilege of having served. He died in California in June of 2004, 10 years into the diagnosis. Whether Reagan had been suffering the early effects of Alzheimer's during his second term is a question the medical record cannot fully answer. The diagnosis came years after the office had been vacated. The neurological assessments that would have made the question answerable in real time had never been conducted. What is on the record is what Cannon saw, what Stahl saw, what Ron Reagan saw, and what Howard Baker decided after a single dinner. The amendment that had been written in part to handle exactly the question they were asking had been ratified 20 years earlier. It was sitting in the National Archives. It had never been used. Baker had been the first man in American history who had a written recommendation to use it. He had read the recommendation. He had had dinner. He had decided not to. In the years after Baker's dinner, the amendment remained unused. 2 more presidents would serve 8-year terms. 2 more would serve 4. 2 more would be elected in their 70s. 2 more would, in the perception of large parts of the country, raise the question Baker had decided not to ask. The country had built the mechanism. The country had been told what the mechanism was for. The country was about to discover something it had been refusing to know. That a tool unused is a tool that does not exist. On the evening of June 27, 2024, the President of the United States, Joseph R. Biden, debated his predecessor and challenger, Donald J. Trump, on a stage in Atlanta, Georgia. The debate was broadcast live to an audience of 51 million Americans. The country watched. Something broke in real time. What had broken was the consensus that had been holding for the previous 3.5 years. The consensus had said that the president, who had been 80 when he had entered office, was operating at full capacity. The consensus had been built and rebuilt by the White House communications staff, by the president's physicians, by the cabinet officers who saw him daily, and by the press corps that covered him. The 90 minutes on the stage in Atlanta did to that consensus what no journalist or political opponent had been able to do in 3 years. Within the week, the conversation in Washington had turned to the 25th Amendment. Senior Democrats, on the record and off, raised the question of Section 4. Senior Republicans raised it more openly. Major newspapers published editorials that named the amendment by section number. The mechanism the country had built 57 years earlier was, for the first time since the Cannon memo, a serious topic of conversation in the West Wing. Section 4 was not invoked. The president on July 21, 2024, withdrew from the campaign. He served out the remaining 6 months of his term. The country had not had to confront the question of whether the cabinet would have acted. The president himself had removed the question from the table. His successor was inaugurated on January 20th, 2025, at the age of 78 years and 7 months. He was the oldest man ever to take the oath of office. In the months that followed, the country would see photographs that would prompt the same question the debate had prompted: the bandaged hand at official events, the swollen ankles in cabinet meeting footage, the face at certain angles, the posts on a social network. The president owned that appeared at hours most people were asleep. The White House would respond to each instance the way Haggerty had responded in 1955, with disclosure, with named physicians, with released medical letters declaring the president in excellent health for his age, with managed photographs taken at the moments most useful to the message. The country would watch. The country would draw conclusions. Section 4 would not be invoked. The pattern crossed every party in American politics. Wilson was a Democrat. Roosevelt was a Democrat. Kennedy was a Democrat. Eisenhower was a Republican. Reagan was a Republican. Biden was a Democrat. Trump is a Republican. The pattern was not partisan. The pattern was the office. In the year America turned 250, the country watched its president and asked, again, the question it had been asking for 133 years. The Constitution that the founding generation wrote did not answer it. The amendment a later generation added did not answer it. The answer is still waiting for the country to give it. 5 presidents in this film, 5 concealments, 5 concealers, 1 amendment ratified in 1967 that the country has never used for the substantive case it was written to handle. 59 years, not once. The story does not end with Reagan. The story does not end with Biden. The story does not end with the president the country is watching now. It ends with the country. Grover Cleveland, cancer of the upper jaw, cut out on a yacht in 1893. The country did not learn for 24 years. Woodrow Wilson, a massive stroke, 17 months of paralysis. The country did not learn until both Wilsons were dead. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, terminal heart failure, a cardiologist's silence. The country did not learn for 25 years. Dwight Eisenhower, a heart attack, a stroke, a bowel resection, each one disclosed, none of them whole. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Addison's disease, 12 daily medications, a doctor who would lose his license. 40 years until the country learned. Ronald Reagan, a memo on a chief of staff's desk, a dinner, a diagnosis announced 6 years too late. The country still does not fully know. Joseph Biden, a debate the country watched in real time, a withdrawal the country accepted instead of the question. And the president the country is watching now. What you watched, the country has watched 8 times. The country has accepted it 8 times. The amendment to handle it is 59 years old. The country has not yet decided to use it.